I am in Sydney, 5 days out from the start of the 2023 FIFA Women's World Cup, and I have with me one of the most important figures in journalism, sports journalism in Australia, Tracey Holmes. Thank you very much, Tracey, for making time for what is going to be a brief conversation, but an important one for me because I've come on the way from India, and it's just only been a few hours for me that I've started to get a sense of the build-up, the vibe on the ground. Tell me a bit about that, and to my viewers watching this from India especially and all around the subcontinent and other parts of the world, what has the build-up been like to the FIFA Women's World Cup in Australia and New Zealand from the Sydney perspective?
I think it very much depends on who you talk to, and so there's a number of different groups. There's a lot of people who are very much insiders of football, who have been saying for I think probably the last 18 months, why doesn't everybody else talk about this already? And then you've got those outsiders who probably don't follow women's football or football of any kind, who have suddenly realised, oh, there's a Women's World Cup and it's on, and it's in our city and numerous other cities around Australia and New Zealand. And so they've suddenly caught onto the buzz. But, you know, at the time that I speak to you now, I've recently come from the last match that the Australian Matildas played against France. So a world-ranked number 5 team, Australia's ranked number 10, and just speaking to all of the fans that went in there, it was a record crowd, over 50,000, so many young girls and so many young boys and families, which is very different to your usual football crowd, which is mostly kind of, you know, young men to old men and some women thrown in. And all of these families were, and the little kids, just so excited about this thing called the Matildas, and they had a concept that the world is coming here and their Matildas were playing with the world. And I think that's a remarkable thing, because when they grow up, they are growing up with this women's team being the highlight and the peak and the norm. And so it's not just a men's team and a comparison with a lesser than women's team. The women's team is it. And it's going to be really interesting to see in 10 years, 15 years, what these people think about and what they talk about when it comes to sport, and maybe not necessarily always making a division between men's sport and women's sport, but it's just sport.
It's just sport, and when it comes to women's sport, Australia does it incredibly well, because I was here the last time Australia hosted a major women's sporting event. That's the 2020 Women's T20 World Cup. 86,174 people turned up at the MCG on 8th March 2020, the highest ever attendance for a women's sporting match in Australia. What you sense could be maybe some takeaways that the Football World Cup could implement from what we saw at the Cricket World Cup in 2020 at the T20 event?
You know, I think the thing is, Australia has a history of organising World Championships, World Cups, Olympic Games. We're organising at the moment our 3rd Olympic Games in Brisbane 2032, so there's a lot that goes into it. And there's a lot of Australians that travel around the world working on these big events all the time. And so I think Australia's taken great pride in the fact that we work on these events as professionally as we can, and it doesn't so much matter what the sport is, what the gender is, whether it's World Cup, World Championship, Olympics, FIFA World Cup, any of that. We always try and put on a show that is going to do better than the last show. And all the sports, they talk to each other, you know, they're always in the same room with each other. And it's a sense of pride, I think, if each sport, each time, can just take it up a step higher and a step higher. And I know that FIFA itself is thinking that once this World Cup is over, it's going to be the largest standalone women's event in the history of sport. Which is quite phenomenal. And then, of course, the hope is for everybody working on it here that when the next one rolls around, it will be bigger again, because growth is what's so important to all of these things.
And it's such a phenomenal time for women's sport across the globe. And you being the kind of advocate of women's sport that you've been, Tracey's also been my mentor at the IOC Young Reporters Program, the International Olympic Committee Young Reporters Program, twice in Buenos Aires 2018 and Lausanne 2020 Winter Youth Olympics. And I know the kind of weight she puts behind young female reporters, but also female athletes in general. Do you sense there is a message that the world could take out of how Australia do women's sporting events and how the media covers it?
Look, I hope so, but that's not to say that we're the best, because we still have a very long way to go ourselves. When you look at photographers who are so crucial and so important in sending the images of whatever it is, it might be news or current affairs or sport, but those images are sent around the world, and that's how the globe interprets the world as it happens. And if all of those images, or a predominance of those images, only come from men, they have a different eye, because we look for different things. And it's only when you start seeing images that come from women and they have a different perspective and they have a different frame and a different lens because they've had a different experience. And then you can broaden that out even further. It's too many white people that are filming these images or editing the stories or recording the interviews. What we need to see is more people who look more like all of the countries that we come from. And until that happens, we haven't got there. And in Australia particularly, because one of the great things about holding international events in Australia is that any country that comes here has a ready-made community. We've got people from every country on the planet living in Australia. But until our media reporting of those events also reflects that and looks like the people from all around the world, then it shows we've still got a long way to go as well. So our coverage of women's sport has increased. There are more women journalists that are coming through, some photographers, some camera people, some editors, but the further up the chain you go, the less and less it is. So yeah, we need to broaden it for everybody. I hope Australia continues developing along that path.
Since this demographic of female content creators, female sports writers, reporters, multimedia producers is increasing, if I may put it that way, what would your message be to young people, young girls wanting to take up sports journalism as a profession? And given you mentor a lot such young women, including myself, I'm also Tracey's mentee at the Women in News and Sport program under the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. She's been my perennial mentor, throughout my career so far, 7 years and running. What would your message be, Tracey, in terms of those who dream of covering major events? Major events is a big thing, right? I am here possibly the only Indian journalist. There are 2 photojournalists I got in touch with on Twitter, but not a single other reporter, writer, which kind of brings into question whether women's football is at all as lucrative for publications. So to raise the hopes of those out there who only want to cover women's sport, women's cricket, women's football, what would you want to tell such young women?
Look, I think I would probably rather give a message to the old men who are running everything. Give the women a chance, because they're there. And it's not even give the women a chance, because I really don't like dividing. I've never liked dividing between men and women or people from here or there. Like, I just think when you walk down the street and you look at the people that are walking past you, they come in all shapes and sizes, they come in all colours, they come from all sorts of cultural backgrounds, they're all ages. Until our media looks like that, then we're losing something, because that is the flavour of life, and that is the flavour of our world. And so recently I've been asked to do some sessions, some talking, some facilitating, and I've actually said no, because it's time that other people had a chance to do that, and people that don't look like me. There was a time when pretty much all of sport was run by old white men. And I just hope we don't get to a situation where all of sport is going to be run by old white men and old white women. So every step of the way needs to reflect that. But for the young women who are out there, and I was a young woman once who wanted to do what I'm doing now, just go and do it. And you just keep knocking, and you don't take no for an answer. You find a way around the barrier, you find a way over the broken bridge, you find a way under the hurdle, you just find a way, and you just keep going. And I recognise that in you when we first met, and what you've done is phenomenal, and now you're in a position to be able to, mentor the next group that are coming through, and they can take such a great lead from what you've done and how you do it. And be creative, and don't take no for an answer.
Be creative. Believe in Mojo, mobile journalism. I'm recording this on an iPhone as taught by Tracey back in 2018 in Argentina, Buenos Aires. But just do it. Sure, it's a tagline of a famous athletic brand. Have you watched the movie Air? Watch it. Ben Affleck, amazing. Connected to that particular brand I'm talking about. But it's such a life motto as well, right?
Yeah,
just do it.
It is.
You've done so many of these world events. You've backed that instinct of yours. Just do it professionally as well. You covered the 2022 Men's Football World Cup in Qatar, and you're on the verge of... You've been leading the coverage here for ABC along with the likes of Samantha Lewis. What's the kind of difference do you have to mentally adjust to in terms of covering a Men's Football World Cup and a Women's Football World Cup?
None. And that's the thing. And I think that's part of the issue. Sometimes we talk about them in a different language, the words we use, and we shouldn't, because it's exactly the same thing. In fact, there's a really great story, and it comes from a football official who is quite senior in the Australian context, and he's got two little boys, and they had been to quite a few Matildas games, because the games happened to happen in Australia, and it was in our time zone, of course. It was when they weren't at school and they got to see them. But he woke them up at like 2 or 3 a.m. when the Australian men's team was trying to qualify for Qatar, and it was a do-or-die match. So he got them up so that they could watch it. And his 5-year-old and 2-year-old were sitting there, and they were looking at each other, and they were looking at the TV and looking back at their dad, and they were kind of confused. And eventually, the 5-year-old said, "Oh, Dad, I get it. These are the boy Matildas," because they'd seen so much of the women's. So in their minds, the women's team was the it team, and these boys, the men's team, they were also Rans. They were coming along next. They were hoping to be what the Matildas are. And so that's a real lesson in what we see and the words that we have to describe things. And I think we need to be conscious as reporters to just do it the same way. And we shouldn't be making adjustments or covering it in a different way or doing stories in a lesser than frame. And I've always tried really hard to approach it the same way, no matter who's playing.
And that's such a great lesson for leaders in the newsroom as well, because the messaging often comes from the top to approach a men's sporting event and a women's sporting event differently. So I hope, especially in the subcontinent where women's sport continues to sort of languish, the publication editors-in-chief take note of what Tracey just mentioned. But speaking of the Matildas, they are at the front and center of the Women's Football World Cup, Australia, New Zealand. Let me put you on the spot a little bit. Do you think the Matildas, the Australian women's national team, can go all the way?
If you asked me 2 months ago, I would have said that's a really tough question, because there are so many great teams. A number of the European teams are so good. The Americans you can never discount. They've won half of every World Cup. The history of the World Cup, they've won half of them.
They are like the Australian women's cricket team. Right?
Yes, exactly. So their dominance, there's no rival. However, what I've learned over many decades of covering major events and big sports is that there always seems to be a particular team or a particular athlete where everything is going right at the right time, and it just keeps getting better and better and more focused, and you start to realise that some of the competition around them have got little fractures here and there, or challenges that they didn't have before, or there's a new brigade coming through and there's some old experienced players but a lot of young ones, so it's not the same chemistry that they had last time around. So there's all of this, and I keep watching the Matildas, and in talking to the Matildas, even hearing from the captain Sam Kerr recently, who puts a lot of pressure on herself, and just seeing how light she was, like that pressure was off her shoulders, and that they are really enjoying this moment. And I thought, oh my gosh, everything is coming right for them at the right time, and it's a home World Cup. So do I think they can win it? Yes, I do.
It's a very definitive answer from an Australian journalist and somebody who's had a bird's eye view of all the proceedings. Finally, 8 teams to make their debut at a Women's Football World Cup. Is there one particular team you're particularly looking forward to make their maiden bow at this edition of the World Cup? Because you have the likes of the Philippines, Haiti, Portugal, great stories, right? Battle against lots of odds. Any particular story that you hold very close to your heart?
Look, I've looked at all of the debutantes because they all have such great stories. Zambia, I really like, but I'm also really fascinated in the story of Haiti. And we don't get a lot of news here about Haiti, but of course everybody knows of the devastation after the earthquake and the difficulties they've had since then in rebuilding everything, not just their society, but their economy, the education system, everything has been such a challenge. And on top of that, and this is sort of like the ugly side of major sport. It's not major sport, it's society, really. There's an ugly side to society. And the man who was the president of the Haiti Football Association is one of the rare people who've ever been banned for life from FIFA because of abuse and allegations of sexual harassment of young players, young female players in the country. So against all of that backdrop, they've qualified for the FIFA World Cup. What an incredible group of women. And so I actually made plans the other day to go and cover their first match because I think it's just an amazing story. And these are the stories, we always focus on those that are going to win or those that look good or those with all the money and the most professionals. But sometimes it's those stories that are the most important ones and for so many people the most fascinating ones because it's the things we don't normally hear about, and these are the real achievers. If they can come to a World Cup and score a goal, that's as good as the USA or Australia winning a World Cup, because it's such a significant leap from where they were previously. So yeah, there's a lot of good stories in the debutantes.
And trust Tracey to be where the stories are, the important ones, not just the fancy ones as she alluded to. Thank you very much for your time, Tracey, because it's very important to get the perspective of somebody who brings in so much experience to sports journalism and coverage of major events. And I hope you have a great World Cup. You've already had a stellar build-up. May you enjoy it as a sports fan as well. But as a journalist, may you keep setting more benchmarks for the younger lot, myself included, to follow, and look forward to more coverage coming from you.
Well, it was so fantastic to see you. And when I walked into the room today at the Football Writers Festival and saw you sitting there, one of the first faces I saw, I was really thrilled. I love following all of your work. The stuff you're doing is amazing. Keep doing it. It's great.
Thank you very much, and thanks especially to Tracey's colleague from the ABC who is walking right past us right now because he helped set the frame and lent me his light against what is easily the most picturesque backdrop I've ever had for an YouTube interview. So thank you, all the ABC journalists who have helped me make this conversation happen. And finally, let's look forward to the FIFA Women's 2023 World Cup. Hopefully I'll be able to get you more coverage from Ground Zero, Sydney.